Thank you very much. And the topic I would like to talk today is, of course, apparently even more difficult than consciousness, freedom. And, but at the same time, freedom is a necessity today when we deal with AI. Because for the first time, AI not only can become aware of itself, whether this is possible or not, I won't address the issue here, but AI may also be pursuing goals. And pursuing goals has to do with the capability of choosing them, which, as I will try to show, is not the same as taking decisions. So I would like to, and it is also very much related with what we refer to, as we saw in the previous talk, with the empathy that we have for another agent. Because an agent is first and foremost an intentional agent. An intentional agent is an agent that has goals, whether they are just attributed as in Dennett's intentional stance or whether they are actual intrinsic goals. And it is also a big issue here, whether goals are real or they're just a social construct, whether they're something that is really part of the fabric of reality, or whether they're just an epistemic shortcut, as they have been addressed many times. And I will address this issue today from a more existential rather than, I would say, cognitive perspective, because I think that the issue of goals gets at the bottom of our own existence, gets at the very root of what a being is in the world. And I started with some gods, because the issue, like in this case, Mars and Venus, but since we are in Greece, today I will take advantage of our close proximity to Mons Olympus and to the land of gods, because gods are related with our capability to have desires and to have value. Gods have been a way, basically, to anthropomorphize the issue that our existence is not simply the taking place of events, but it is something that has some kind of value. To be is something that is, in a way, different from mere happening. So it's, I would like to start from a quotation by Christopher Marlowe, 1590. That Christopher Marlowe had exactly the same age as Galileo Galilei. They were both born in 1564. And it is amazing that in two different places in Europe, they were addressing from totally different perspective. Marlowe was a literate, and Galileo was a scientist, the same topic. And that's not by chance, that's not by accident, because at the end of 16th century, beginning of 17th century, people were creating the modern notion of the human being. The modern subject had been created in those years. In fact, Galileo, a few years later, wrote the famous essay on the Essayer, where he made the famous split between qualities and quantities, between physical properties and subjective properties. That was later, 10 years later, developed further by René Descartes. We all know about that. But it is important to remember that, because today we are going through a similar, I think, moment, turning point. AI is really putting all our beliefs about our own existence, about our models of what a subject is, to question. And so I think that the modern notion of the subject is today getting to a kind of deep revision because of the impact of AI. And what's the point of this quotation by Marlowe? The point of this quotation is that Marlowe is telling us that the point of reason cannot be just that of doing logical deductions. There must be something else. It cannot be just the point of bene disserere, of being able to dispute well. There must be something different, miracles, because otherwise there would be no point in reading. Then read no more. And there must be a greater subject. And what is this greater subject? It is expressed by that apparently mysterious expression at the bottom, on kaimeon. On kaimeon was taken from Aristotle, and it means to be or not to be. And 10 years later was exploited, as we all know, by his friend, William Shakespeare. And to be or not to be is the key point of value. It's the key point of why we want something rather than nothing. And so let me make you an example. If you have to go to a place, what's the first thing that you do today? You ask to an AI to give you the route. And the AI has all the knowledge of the world and provides you with the route to go from point A to point B. But there is a choice before that decision. There was an act of freedom before that calculations. This act of freedom was to choose what was the value on the basis of which you were going to do the computation. And of course, you could choose the fastest, the shortest, the cheapest, the most ecological. And those are values. But how could you choose technically, computationally, between such values? Yes, you could say, I have an overarching value. I can have Bentham-Hedonic calculus. I can have the maximization of existence. I can have the maximization of happiness. But why happiness rather than the sheer number of individuals? And after all, why they should be happy? They could just multiply as much as they can. And would it be better to live longer or to have a greater number of individuals? What would it be better? There's no way to get out of this problem that the criterion at the top of everything is always something that cannot be decided computationally. There is an irreducible element of freedom at the very beginning of any decision. There's always a choice. If I had to leave you just with a bottom line, I would say there's always a free choice before any actual decision. And we see that in all examples in our life, when we get in love, when we do an act of creation, when, as Thomas Eliot said, when we create a new artwork, we change all the previous ones. Why? Because the new real artwork is not just creating a new example, it's not just generating content like AI, but is adding the new criterion on the basis of which a certain content has value. That's the point of, and that is like love. When you get in love, when Romeo gets back after meeting for the first time with Juliet, he says to his best friend, the Romeo that met you today, this evening, is different from the Romeo that said hello to you this morning. Why? Because every act of freedom is first and foremost not just a selection in a space of possibility, but it is an act of creation of the subject that is going to make that selection. And it's my worry that many of the models that I went through, and now I take advantage of the presence of Andy, that I've been, whose work I've been studying all my life, and whose recent book I've just fresh of the reading of it, that all those models try to reduce this irreducible aspect. So it's not a critique to Andy in particular, but to a whole broad approach to reduce these irreducible aspects of our existence to something that, after all, is not able to cope with such an aspect that is not irrational, but that it is before any attempt of being rationalized, of being reduced to a set of concepts and their own related reduction. When I must make a parenthesis, when I started my career as an engineer, I would have never been able to predict that one day I would have made such a plea for an irreducible element of not rational reality inside existence. That is really something that came to as a surprise to myself. But my point is that whenever we try to reduce everything to something that we can totally express in terms of, for example, a model like a Bayesian machine, like predictive coding, like a prediction, we are leaving something aside, let alone that we are not totally able to explain why should it be the case that out of such intermediate and finite element, computational element, should come out not only consciousness, but also the value on the basis of which that being is going to find something worth in its, his, her, theirs existence. And of course, I believe that many fallacies are not really fallacies, but there are symptoms that something has been left outside of the picture. For example, this double subject fallacy, better known as the me and my brain fallacy, the fact that many times when we refer to such models, we feel the need to bring in something that is the subject of the brain rather than the brain itself, is related with the fact that we feel that there is some kind of irreducible element that has been left out. And so why are we talking often, even in neuroscientific, very respectable journal, as though we are not our brain, as though the brain is making us doing something? Because we feel that something has been left out of the picture. Something that maybe is not just a phenomenal aspects or character of processes, but it is something deeper, something that, as we will see, has to do with the gods themselves. And be warned that I'm a total physicalist. So when I speak about the gods, I don't speak about transcendental God. But this is very consistent here in Greece, because famously the Greek mythology is not a transcendent theology, but it is a more immanent and friendly kind of, not always so friendly, as we will see. So I just like to take advantage of the presence of Clark here to say that, for example, if we take a sentence like that, my unconscious prediction pulled my perceptual experience in that direction, creating a short-lived hallucination that was soon corrected as more information flowed in through my senses, I would say that there are many aspects here that defeat the illustration of what's going on. Since we haven't much time here, I won't get too much into the detail, but basically what I would like to point out that we often use some terms, and I will just refer to the first one that I highlighted here, namely unconscious prediction, that they suggest that there's already some element of mentality in what we're talking about. And this element of mentality, in my view, has the risk of kind of begging the question. Like I would like also to refer to the same, I could say the same for example, information or for the notion of models. The idea that we try to present, to smuggle in something that is not 100% physical, and therefore something that is going to, in a way, to bias our explanation of the mentality. So we are kind of question begging the explanation, because we start from something that is already not totally physical, and then we use that to support our notion of the mental and of the physical and of values themselves. So this argument here, of course, it was more related with consciousness, but it's also the same with values. And in particular, the example that I want to make, why I don't think that this explanation are going to be able to hop on the existential aspect that has been often, I would say, conflated on conscious experience, I would address the issue of prediction in particular. So when we say that the brain does guesses, that the brain does prediction, we are suggesting that the brain is doing something that is already not totally physical, that is already in a way, but is a prediction really something that requires something different from just physical occurrences, just from physical events? And so I want to provide you with a very simple example of prediction that doesn't require anything physical, just to sort of say, just to get rid of the spell that sometimes this terminology suggests us, casts on us. So suppose that I'm picking up pebbles from a sample. And rather than throwing them away, I put them in a jar. After a while, what is the best predictor of the first order statistical property of the sample of pebbles I'm picking up? The pebbles in the jar. If I were to pick up a new pebble from the jar, the probability that that pebble is going to make, quote, a prediction of what's going to happen next from the beach, from the original sample of the pebbles, is going to be a good predictor, because the two samples would have exactly the same first order properties. But in this way, I would not need to put anything physical, anything mental there. I would not need to speak in terms of probability, although speaking of probability would make sense if I would use those first order probability as a model of what a mind does. Likewise, let's suppose that I do things a little bit more complex. Rather than having one jar, I have two jars. And so whenever I pick up a white pebble, whatever I pick up, I put it into the white jar. And whenever I pick up something after a black pebble, I put it into the black labeled jar. In this way, I will build up two jars that will have the second order Bayesian statistical properties of that sequence of jar. And you may see that there is just one white jar, the white pebble after the white pebble, and in fact in the jar there is a white pebble. So I could use those two jars to do Bayesian properties. Now, if I had an infinite set of jars, or a very huge set of jars, let me see if, okay, we can have a huge set of jars, we would have we could be able to build an LLM or a Bayesian structure of a brain using just a huge number of jars. That would be highly impractical, of course, but basically that's what an LLM is, an enormous network of jars that are connecting with all the possible combinations. But if we saw a Bayesian system like that, we would have a system that would not require to be described anything like prediction. It would be just, and it would be all the outcome of the past. Why did I went through all of that? To say that if we have a purely finite description of a physical system, that physical system is compelled to be either deterministic or undeterministic. And in either case, we don't need to add anything, in my understanding, we don't need to add any mental description to that system. We can just describe that, well, it may be cumbersome. So I am totally in agreement with what Daniel Dennett once said, that intentionality is epistemically not reducible, irreducible, meaning that when we want to explain something, it might be that at the level of our description, there are concepts that cannot be set aside. Fine, great. I totally agree with that. But does that mean that that those concepts have to be reified? That those concepts like information, probability, prediction, models have to be an additional ontology of reality? I don't think so. But then what does that mean for our freedom? I think that is the key. That is the crux of the matter. If we conceive of ourselves as a finite physical system, there's no space left for freedom, no matter what. No, because the physical system is wholly described by this kind of reductionistic explanation. A prediction can be reduced just to the outcome of previous events that are just producing jars or whatever fancy structure you have, an LLM or in a brain, that is just the outcome of the past. There's no space left for an extra pebble doing whatever it wants. So what might freedom be? let me get back to Marlowe. On kai meon, to be or not to be. Freedom is the fact that the system we are made of is not finite. It's not finite in the sense that it is, I would say, out of the physical picture, but that it doesn't have a fixed set of brackets into which we can consider the system to be. Let me put it differently. Is my hand free? Of course not, because my hand is determined by my brain. There's no degree of freedom between my brain and my... But is my brain free? Not at all. There's no degree of freedom between my past environment and what my brain is doing now. There's a causal chain that, of course, it is hugely complex and nobody can be able to trace it down, but it's just like that. But the point is, where am I? Where is the thing that I am? And I thought that this provides us with an insight with many aspects about our existence. Since here we are in this atmosphere of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and the like, that world, yesterday, speaking with Joshua, we came out with an example that made me think last night, that during the ancient Roman Empire, human life had no value. We're getting back to the notion of value. But it had a price. You can buy a human being, a slave. Today, at least in theory, human life has no price. You cannot buy a human being. Although in practice we know we have plenty of counterexamples to that. But in theory, you cannot do that. But it has value. And for years, I thought that this was an historical accident, just an improvement of our social environment. But then I thought that the two cases are mutually incompatible. Why? Because price is part of a quantitative relational network, is defined by reason, is defined by computation, while value cannot be defined by computation. Value is the act of Romeo with Juliet. He was not thinking about what was the most smart course of action in Verona with his friend, for his future, for his career, for having the greater and the most happy number of children, offsprings. He didn't think about anything like that. He was able to embrace value. For him, value was Juliet. And that value was not reducible to anything else, to be or not to be. And this notion is at the core of the gods, of the Greek mythology. It is the famous, not Apollon, sorry for the typo, between Apollo and Dionysus. Between Apollon and Dionysus, there is a dark irrational, not irrational, but irrational, not rational, before rationality itself, that expressed this fight, which is at the bottom of our existence. And that is why we mention the fact, rightly so, that rationality is not necessarily keen, is not necessarily empathic. And in fact, there is the famous episode where Apollo is flying alive Marcia. And look at how Apollo is detached, is serene. He doesn't feel any empathy. He doesn't suffer for, he doesn't feel any value. Because Apollo, the god of the sun is the symbol of reason in many ways, of rationality, the lights of the sun, the light, enlightenment. You know, the light, enlightenment, as of the French Revolution, is the sun, is the symbol of pure reason. Pure reason has no value. Pure reason doesn't need values. And so it can do the best thing and the worst thing without even flinching. Because to flinch, you need to have value. And here in Greece, we have the famous myth of Athena that sprang totally clad in armor from the head of Zeus. And Zeus, so Athena represents reason from the head of Zeus. But Zeus represents the origin, the irrational, the deep, the dark bottom of existence. Was the god of Cronus, was the god of the nephew of Uranus. And this idea emerges again and again from Schopenhauer, from Eliot, from David Hume, where in the treaty, where he says that famously, very famously, that reason is slave to passions. Because there's no way reason is going to find its own passion inside itself. And so I'm getting to the conclusion. I've been more than in my allowed time slot.
You've got 7 minutes to go.
Okay. With the quotation that always gave me a lot to think about, that had been taken advantage of in the last James Bond movie, where he said that the proper function of man is to live, not to exist. And to live, he says, in another part of this passage that by mistake I didn't copy, that I will not try to prolong, to waste my days just for the sake of it. What did he mean? Did he mean that he didn't want to live as long as possible? Not at all. He meant that just to pursue the goal of extending just the number of days is not enough. And if you reduce your own existence just to that quantitative optimization, function optimization, you're just wasting your existence. There must be something else. There must be what Marlowe said, Marlowe's Faust wants something greater than just the capability to deduce. And we find the same idea everywhere. And the same idea is that value is outside of the domain of logic, but it's not outside the domain of our existence. Therefore, existence is something greater than logic. And I would say, what is freedom? For years, I thought that freedom was either a mistake, a cognitive mistake, or was something that must happen inside a domain set by reason, by logic. Inside that domain, inside that perfectly logical description of reality, we act freely. No, it's not that, because there would not be any space for freedom inside that space. That space is perfectly defined, it's perfectly self-consistent. What is freedom? Freedom is the creation of that space. Freedom is the creation because freedom is existence. Freedom is existence, and existence defines the space inside which reason plays its tricks. And that's why this sentence at the end of a movie, John Milius, The Wind and the Lion, always struck me as having something deep to say. At the end of a movie where everything goes bad for those two characters, one of them says to his friend, Great Resuli, we have lost everything. All is drifting on the wind, as you said. We have lost everything. So reason has been defeated. All their plans failed. All their computations didn't get anywhere. But the Resuli, the guy on the right, replied, Sheriff, is there not one thing in your life that is worth losing everything for? Speaking of a space of possibility, this amounts to say that existence can always find an additional dimension that was not included into the original space. And that, I think, is the act of freedom. So I will end. I'm sorry that, where is Shu? That Shu, in a way, spoiled. I had exactly the same Dave's Hamlet-like picture, but I didn't want to change it last minute. So with the Hamletic, very famous question. And I would like to ask you to read it after my talk to see whether it gives you some meaning, some value that maybe in the past wasn't able to give you. To be or not to be, this is the question. Whether this is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrow of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. Once again, to be or not to be. So happiness is not enough. So the question is, what is the question? And asking what is the question means to hop out of the existing rational domain and to ask the meaning of it, the value of that. And it is even more, I think, impressive, the end of the monologue. Conscience does make cowards of us all. And thus the native hue of resolution is sickened of her, with a pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pitch and moment, with disregard the current stern awry, and lose the name of action. Shakespeare, forgive me for this reading, but the point is existence. That was the point of the Danish prince. The point was existence requires us to reply to the fundamental question, why something has value rather than nothing. And that is a question that does not find an answer inside reason. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this presentation. Thank you for all organizing this wonderful event. So I owe you an apology because I slightly changed the topic I'm going to talk about. So now it sounds more doubtful since it was before, and now I have actually a question mark at the end. So a framework for exploring consciousness. I changed it because I realized that today I would have stood on the same stage as the real guys of consciousness. And I'm not really sure I deserve this place because when I started my PhD, that is finally done, almost 4 years ago, I had like this huge crush on consciousness. But now I feel like my crush is over. And now I'd like to explain you why, and maybe you can change my mind, I hope. So in my experience, consciousness is like a handsome and smart guy. I don't know why if you put on ChatGPT handsome smart guy, it comes out with a leather jacket, so we should think about it. So he's this kind of guy that flatters you a lot, and he's gonna tell you everything about the world, and he is so handsome and cute, and he kind of tries to bring you out, but then when the final day of your dates arrives, you're all dressed up, you're ready, and you're here, so consciousness is coming, but now then consciousness ghosts you. And you're there wondering why, and it does this with all the girls around, and you all know that this happens, but still everyone loves consciousness, and everyone just can't resist him. So, and you girls talk about this, and you say why this happens, but we are still here. So after being ghosted so many times by consciousness, I tried to let him go. And I started dating another guy, which is predictive processing. And predictive processing is very reliable, and it does not tell you lies. It comes the time that you agreed, and so here we are. My talk today, I'm trying to express my doubts about the cool guy with consciousness, and specifically about the relationship between him and the frameworks of free energy principle, predictive processing, and active inference. And then I'm gonna show you how this is tied to the matter of artificial sentience. And lastly, I will argue to what extent does this really tell something about consciousness. So now comes the boring part. The free energy principle is a framework that many of you have known, I think. It is basically a unified account for exploring almost everything. It was theorized by the neuroscientist Carl Friston, and in the debate about cognitive system, it has gained a lot of attentions recently, and it has been ascribed by philosophers and neuroscientists as well as a unifying principle that can be applied across multiple disciplines, so from thermodynamics to biology to social sciences as well. And according to one of the early formulations by Friston, the free energy principle says that any self-organizing system that is at equilibrium with the environment must minimize free energy. So essentially, it is a framework that explains how adaptive systems, where by adaptive systems we mean everything from a single cell to much wider systems such as us or the world as well, are able to persist through time to maintain their internal equilibrium, the internal equilibrium and the equilibrium between themselves and the environment to the minimization of the so-called free energy. And by free energy, we mean basically a function of the difference between the states, the internal states of an organism, and of the external states that causes that internal states. And to make it very, very simple, the idea is that an organism that acts by minimizing free energy reduces uncertainty, reduces entropy, and reduces surprise about future states. So we could say, maybe, I'm not sure, so deny me if it's not like that, that a practical implementation of free energy principle might be considered predictive processing, which is, as we know, a unified framework for cognition, action, and perception. The idea is that the brain is a predictive machine that tries to predict its next states basing on the information about previous interaction with the environment. And this happens through the so-called active inference, which is, as Suzanne also said this morning, is a Bayesian mechanism, basically. So the idea of active inference is that an organism that acts through active inference updates the model of the own model of its world through observation of inference of the external world. And by doing this, it suppresses prediction errors and it reduces free energy or surprise about the next states. And this framework, basically the framework of free energy principle, has been applied to the study of consciousness as well. In the words of Allen Hobson and Carl Friston from 2014, consciousness is like finding the best probabilistic explanation for our sensorium, where by best they mean Bayes-optimal explanation. And the sensorium, again, is basically the things that are caused inside us by the external causes. When Friston talks about consciousness, he basically likes to underline the idea that various theories of consciousness, every theory of consciousness have something that is right, and he tries to understand which are the dots that all unify these different theories of consciousness, and he tries to highlight different aspects that he finds interesting of that. And basically his idea that everything, consciousness is a dynamical and relational process, and he tries to study it by the lens of physics, and also by teaming up with different people that have also different opinions about consciousness. When it comes to specifically predictive processing, in the words of Andy Clark from his last book, predictive processing tells us a lot about what might be described as basic sentience. So we know that now we're not talking anymore about consciousness. And sentience is, recalling Bentham, again in the words of Andy, something that we need to have a differentiation between the capacity to feel and the capacity to think and reason. And again, predictive processing tells us about basic sentience, and basic sentience is something that occurs whenever a creature encounters its world as a meaningful arena for action. So when it treats different states of that world as attractive or unattractive, as providing or foreclosing opportunities. And we can detect sentience in creatures or robots whose take on the external world is pervasively responsively to their brain or control systems' take on their own inner bodily worlds and their own states of action readiness. So if I understood correctly, the idea is that we can detect sentience in creatures whose perception of the external world is influenced by the brain perception of their own internal world. So to wrap up, predictive processing offers a promising story about how behavioral patterns might be ushered into being by the constant effort to predict internal and external sensory variation and to minimize prediction errors. And he asks, does this constitute true sentience, or might it be still merely apparent sentience? He says that he's not actually convinced that this is the right question to ask. Nevertheless, a lot of literature has flourished about this topic, and has flourished about the attempt to link active inference and consciousness. And specifically, it has been used a lot to model, to research on introspection, self-modeling, and self-access. Self-modeling, self-access, and introspections are, in the words of Limanowski and Frisson, and also in Maxwell Ramsey, Edwards, and colleagues, are component for consciousness. By introspection, we mean the ability to access and evaluate one's own mental states, thoughts, and experience. And also, introspection is important because it has a critical role in self-awareness, learning, and decision-making as well. So all these abilities represent components of human consciousness and provide a basis for critical self-assessment as well. Oh, sorry. Okay. And specifically, Mawal Barassan and colleagues, here we are, try to formalize a three-level generative model for modeling consciousness. And the basic idea is that this is built on self-access and introspection as well. And the basic idea is that self-access is kind of a must-have of a system to report and evaluate its own conclusions. So the idea is that some parts of the system can use the outputs of other parts of the system as their own input. Because a system, in order to draw on conclusion about what its own decision, needs to have self-access. And this is strictly tied in to introspection and to the idea that cognitive processes have to be opaque in order to be accessed by the system as well. So active inference doing also a further step, again, specifically in Giovanni Pezzulo, Parr, and Frisson, and again in Ippolito, Albarracin, and Inés, is strictly defined as a way to understand sentience behavior. But here, I think that becomes something to be, they begin to go on kind of slippery slope, because when it comes to explain sentience, as we saw, we need to see that there is an ambiguity of the term. And this is specifically underlined by Seth. Indeed, some people uses the word sentience to denote mere sensitivity or responsiveness, so without implying the idea that there is actually a conscious experience, while others use it to mean as a form of consciousness that is valued, and so we have all what we talked about, the experience of feeling good or feeling bad. And in relationship to artificial consciousness, Inés Ippolito, Mawal Barassan, and Jacqueline Inés consider that sentience can be measured externally only, so by checking in some way its outcomes, and sentience should be considered as compounded by three things, which are active self-maintenance, historical adaptability, and autonomous agency. By active self-maintenance, we mean that sentience maintains its systemic integrity to continuous coordination with the environment, yet resisting entropy. And by historical adaptability, we mean that sentience behavior is shaped by the history of its interaction, so it shows a behavior that is strictly dependent on some dynamics that already occurred. And lastly, by autonomous agency, we mean that sentience begins actions basing on its internal dynamics. So it does not actually answer to environmental triggers, but just on its internal dynamics. We can see that active inference active inference-based system can display behavior that looks like sentience. So they adapt, they model themselves, and they exhibit this kind of self-awareness. But I think we can spot some issues in this kind of literature. The first one that it comes to my mind is that behavior is different from consciousness. So we risk to mistake like operational coherence for phenomenal consciousness, since it looks to me that there is kind of shift from what is like to how well does this perform. And moreover, if we think to that model of sentience, which is composed by three things, it's not really clear to me when does sentience occur. So does sentience is something more than all these components or not? And if it is not something more, why do we actually need the word sentience? The second issue that I found is that function is not the same thing as phenomenology. So again, we spot the epistemic ambiguity of the term sentience, and the agent seems to be sensitive, seems to be adaptive, even self-reflective, but there is no guarantee that anything is actually felt. And again, if we define sentience as only through external indicators, are we really talking about consciousness? Or is this kind of operational surrogate? I don't know. And sometimes it looks also so to me that we are kind of, with this kind of literature, we're building a behaviorist theories of consciousness, but it is disguised as a computational one. So although active inference is a very, very powerful framework in my view, it looks like that it explains behavior so effectively that we're actually forgetting about experience altogether. And it looks like consciousness is sometimes what remains after everything else is modeled. And it looks to me as well that we are kind of drifting away from the original formulation of predictive processing, since from a theory of basic sentience that is profoundly grounded in felt experience, some kind of literature shifts to a functional account of sentience, and which is reduced just to observable control and regulation. So if we try to stay away from the slippery slope of consciousness, sentience, and stuff, and if we stick just to the idea of being in the world, it looks to me that there is something which is not very clear as well, because what comes to my mind is, are we using predictive processing to actually model our being in the world, or we are influencing and engineering it? And these are very different questions, because to model is not to influence, and it looks like sometimes consciousness tries to be a reliable guy and disguises himself as predictive processing, but actually no, this is just confusing. And so it looks like to me that we are really confusing these two very different questions. So I still stick to dating predictive processing for now, but I'm not sure if this is the right thing to do. So I'm gonna ask you what you think about this, and I think that's all. Thank you.